Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In this episode, we'll be finishing off the Hobby Boss 1/72nd scale TBM-3 Avenger by adding a vacuformed canopy, applying some weathering, and finishing off the last of this kit's details. So, without further ado, let's get this one finished. While the varnish cured, I created a copy of the kit's canopies with my vacuforming machine, which was done by filling up the original kit's canopy with milliputch to give it an internal structure that was somewhat heat resistant. After that it had 24 hours to harden, I would then use my dental vacuform machine and some 1mm thick clear styrene to make some new canopies. I ended up making two since the first one was a little bit dodgy, and although the clarity was pretty much the same as the kit's and the distortion reduced, unfortunately the framework was not as sharp and defined, which would have an impact later on. I cut out the canopy from the vacuform sheet and then cut it into 3 sections so that I could have it open or closed where the pilot's area is. And the new canopy fitted pretty nicely with only some light trimming required. When I removed the masks from the turret, I found that they'd worked pretty well, but since I'd painted the turret while it was on the aircraft, some spots would still need to be touched up, especially at its base. While painting the main canopy's framework, I also touched up the turret and did some extra corrections around the edges of the cockpit on the fuselage, using the same interior green mix from earlier on. While that colour dried, I painted the propeller hub and engine radiators with Vallejo Model Colour Natural Steel, and the tip of the propeller spinner with Vallejo Model Air Aluminium. The external canopy colours were then applied, being either USNC Blue or Intermediate Blue for parts of the turret. Since I'd used acrylic paints for the canopies, after they'd dried I could then use a cocktail stick to remove any excess paint or mistakes, helping to neaten up the canopy's framework. When it came to weathering the aircraft, the first step I did would be the usual metal chipping. I did this by dipping a fine brush in some Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, wiping the excess off with some paper towel, and then stippling the brush very gently into the areas I wanted to add some metal chipping. Most of the photos of Avengers I looked at didn't really have much in terms of metal chipping, so I decided to keep the effect very subtle and light. The areas I chipped included the leading edges of the propeller blades, the front of the engine cowling, along the various access panels maintenance crews would regularly open, around the footholes the crew would have used to get into the aircraft, and along the wing in spots where foot traffic from the pilots and ground crew would be. Next, the engine received a heavy coating of Tamiya black panel accent for some oil and grime, as well as to highlight the engine's details. The panel liner was also then applied along the recessed panel lines along the fuselage to again add some grime and dirt build-up in the recesses and to highlight the kit's surface details. In the past, I'd always removed the panel liner with X20 enamel thinners, but after the strange peeling I encountered when doing my 2 Airfix RAAF Beaufighters, I decided to instead try dipping a brush or cotton swab in AK odorless thinners, and then rub away the excess panel liner, leaving it only in the recesses. I found that the odorless thinners didn't seem to do as good a job as the X20, so they took a bit more time and rubbing to wear away the enamel wash, but it did do the job eventually and didn't do any damage to the varnish layers underneath. I also found that the cotton bud was a bit more effective than a brush, though they did work pretty well together by using the brush to first apply the odorless thinners and then rubbing over the area with the cotton bud. The enamel wash also seemed to become a little bit more blended when the odorless thinners were used rather than straight up removed, so the effect ended up a little bit more subtle and blended, which I was quite happy with. Once the fuselage was done, I then repeated the process of applying the panel liner followed by the odorless thinners along the wings, the landing gear, and on the separate part for the closed bomb bay. Apart from having to repair the right side landing gear, the enamel wash was done without any issues, so I then returned to the main canopy. Since my usual method hadn't worked out so well, I decided to try using the kit's included masks and airbrush the main canopy after I'd scratched off the hand-painted layers. I also found a cocktail stick was very helpful to push down the edges of the masks and also make small adjustments so they lined up correctly. The masks fitted the new part pretty well, though I did find a few spots where the framework was rather narrow, especially towards the rear of the canopy, but it could have been the way that I'd applied them. The mask canopies were then attached to some blue tack to protect their insides from any overspray, and also to give me something to hold onto while painting them. The canopies were then sprayed with their interior colour using a mixture of interior green and US dark green like from before, and after that had dried, which didn't take too long, I then sprayed them with some USNC blue for their external colour. I did consider priming them, but the primer colour would have shown up as the frame's interior colour, so I decided to instead just use the green. Once the external colour was dry, I removed the masks and found they'd done a perfect job, and I had some very nice and sharp canopy frames that were nicely defined despite the softer moulded framework. I don't usually like to mask canopies, so this was one of the first I've actually done, though I am tempted to try it again in future builds, especially if I have pre-cut masks. Now that they were painted, I could glue the forward and rear canopy sections to the fuselage with some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue, since this glue dries strong like super glue but doesn't fog up clear parts. This was then followed by adding the inside framework that the sliding section would go over the top of, which was created with some 1mm styrene glued to the front and rear canopy sections. Some of the styrene was also cut to a triangle and glued to the top of the tail to replace the missing antenna, which must have come off earlier on. The pitot tubes, antennas and other fine parts were painted by brush on the sprues, and once they'd been painted I cut them out and glued them to the model. For some reason the instructions and kit include a pitot tube on both sides of the aircraft's wings, but after double checking my references I believe that the Avenger only ever had one pitot tube and this was located on the left side. There are also some small U-bend things that go on the wingtips, a mast which I glued with the Rocket Odorless CA glue to the separated sliding canopy segment, and two radar antennas under the wings on each side, which have a plastic base piece and a bit of photo etch for the actual antennas. The exhausts had been painted with Model Air Chrome as a base colour and then glued behind the engine cowling, but they required a fair bit of sanding before they would fit into place properly. Earlier on, I'd broken the kit's original rear turret and wing 50 cal machine gun barrels, so I had to 3D print some replacements, which I then glued into place. The exhausts then received some touch-ups with Model Air Chrome, the pitot tube and nav lights on the wings with Model Air RLM01 Silver for their shiny parts, and the machine gun barrels with Model Air Gunmetal Metallic. The antennas also received some small touch-ups with the various camouflage colours, before I then moved on to the last weathering step, which would be some oil paint weathering. A drop of Abteilung 502 white, black, engine grime and flat earth oil paint was squeezed out onto some cardboard, and then sat aside for 2 hours to let the excess oil bleed out of the paints before use. I then used a selection of brushes to apply the oil paints, along with some odorless thinners to both reactivate the slightly dried paints, and also to soften or remove the excess oil paint from the model with careful brushing. The first effect I created was some gun stains and soot on the machine guns with some black, followed by some leaks and stains around the landing gear and shell ejection ports on the underside of the wings. For the leaks, I applied the paint with a fine brush and then used a larger one dipped in thinners to streak the paint backwards in the direction air would flow over the wings in flight, creating some streaks. Heavy oil stains were then added around the engine using a mix of black and engine grime, while the exhausts received a base coating of black for the darker stains at their exits. Since I'd done painting and fading on the upper wings before the decals had been applied, they looked a little bit too new compared to the paint job, so I decided to add some fading to them by dabbing on very small amounts of the white, primarily in the middle of the panels around the roundels, and then I used a brush dipped in the thinners to soften the effect and remove it from spots until I was happy with the faded effect on the roundels. Looking at reference photos, the exhausts on most Avengers seemed to be very dark and concentrated to just behind the exhaust, often with some streaking onto the bomb bay doors, and a tiny bit sometimes getting flicked up towards the wings. I also noticed that many photos showed brown stains a bit further back that are quite prominent on the bomb bay doors, so I gradually built up this effect as well, making sure to also apply them to the closed bomb bay option when I have the doors switched on the model. The bomb bay seems to be a particular source for a lot of leaks and stains, so I added some with black and engine grime along the seam lines where the doors meet, and also streaked backwards towards the tail where photos show these stains can be particularly noticeable. Some photos showed brownish stains at the wing roots, so I applied a thin layer of engine grime and blended it in with some odorless thinners. A darker, more prominent streak of this colour was then added, coming back from the fuel filler ports, and then I dabbed a tiny bit of the engine grime along the wing's folding point for some subtle leaks and stains. To add some fresh oil marks and leaks, I dabbed a very small amount of Tamiya X1 Gloss Black enamel paint around the engine cowling, and then gently removed the excess with the odorless thinners to create some tiny little leaks, which often occur even with well-maintained engines. As the saying goes, if a radial engine isn't leaking oil, there's probably none in it. The oil paints take quite a long time to dry, so I left the model aside for 24 hours, before I then added some bits of sprue to create some basic landing lights to the underside of the wings. These were then painted a coat of RLM01 silver, and while they dried, I painted the nav lights with Tamiya clear red on the left light and clear green on the right one. When I tried to put the landing lights from the kit into place, I found that they were too wide, so I decided to just apply a film of micro crystal clear over the lights to act as the clear cover, and with much difficulty I sanded and pushed the nav light and the leading edge wing lights into place, and then glued them with some odorless CA glue. The last detail to add to the aircraft was the rigging for the radios, which I created using some AK Interactive mega thin rigging wire. This was superglued to the tail and then stretched to the canopy mast and glued into place, and then the excess was removed. This process was then repeated with a smaller line which runs from the rear of the canopy up to the main rigging line. I almost forgot to finish the kit's included armament, but after the bombs had been sprayed Model Air USAF olive drab, the front of the torpedo and the fuel tanks with Model Air aluminium, the attachment points had been painted to match the aircraft's interior, the torpedo prop had been painted model colour gold, and all of these parts had been varnished by brush, I could finally call my Hobby Boss TBM-3 Avenger build finally completed. And here you can see the results I achieved with this model. So I'm super happy with how this one turned out, and I think this build is quite a strong contender for the best one I've done so far. I'm especially happy with how the camouflage and weathering turned out, and I feel I've applied a lot of what I learnt when doing Pappy Boyington's Corsair with the Hasegawa kit previously, especially in terms of fading the paint on the upper wings and tying in the decals with the weathering. Though I probably should have spent a bit more time improving the kit's surface finish, perhaps with some more sanding and also filling of one or two gaps or accidental scratches, I reckon I can still improve my vacuform canopy further, and of course I'm also welcome to other people's feedback and suggestions on other things I can improve. The kit itself went together alright, with the issues I have mainly being the extra cleanup required due to some of the awkward ways parts were attached to the sprue, some of the turret parts being especially fragile and flimsy, the somewhat poor fit of most of the clear parts, and also the kit's lack of an open cockpit canopy out of the box when you have such a fantastic interior and also no crew figures to display the aircraft in flight. But negative points aside, the kit has fantastic detail both on the inside and the outside, the option for folded wings, a nice selection of rockets, bombs, extra fuel tanks, or a torpedo for armament. It seems to be pretty spot on apart from the extra pitot tube, and although double the cost of the older Academy kit, I think it's definitely worth that extra cost if you want a much more detailed kit. It's definitely a fiddling and slightly challenging build, so I wouldn't recommend it unless you have patience and a bit of modelling skill already, but if you do and you want a nice detailed Avenger, it's definitely a fantastic kit I would recommend, and one I'm almost certainly going to build again someday in the future. Thank you very much for watching this build video. I do hope you've enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you don't miss any future build videos. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use when I make them, and the time I spend making these videos. I had been hoping to get this video done a little bit sooner, but I ended up spending a lot of last week racing to get an Airfix Banshee done for a group build, which I'll be doing a build video on in the future. I should have another inbox review video ready for the end of this week, and keep your eyes out as I will be doing another build video very soon on another Grumman aircraft that was used on aircraft carriers. That's it for now though, but until the next one, as always, take care and model on.